Good evening. You're listening to the Xtreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Tonight's episode, Xtreme TV. Tonight, we're discussing Kolchak, Season 1, Episode 9, The Spanish Moss Murders. And tonight with me is the Night Talker himself, a.k.a. Professor Pixel. And Professor, let me start off by saying that a lot of people love this episode and think it's one of Kolchak's best. And I get some of those reasons. And then I think there's the other group that I almost feel like I'm going into because I'm like, the whole idea of bodies showing up with Spanish moss as like your clue is kind of stupid. And you and I both live here in dirty Central Florida, so we know what Spanish moss is all about. I liked what the idea of some things in this episode, but I'm not sure of the execution on it too. But before we dive into any particular scene, what's your initial impression?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. If this episode was simply about a swamp monster who had come through the sewers of Chicago, maybe that would have been better. But it did feel off. It's another one of those episodes where you need to sit down and you need to pay attention, but even then you might get a little lost along the way. It's a solid episode of Kolchak, I guess.
Yeah, for me, I look at it and I go, I'm starting to think this show hates women because they kill off all the hot ones early on like they do here. But, all these people are starting to get killed. And then there's like the Spanish moss on which he, goes to the lady to find out what it's all about. And she's like, oh, well, there's none around here for 1,000 miles because of the temperature and the conditions needed for it, the humidity, stuff you and I live with 8 months out of the year here in Central Florida. So I can understand it being a bit of an anomaly going there. And it's got a little bit of its detective kind of stuff going on with it, the way it was like with Kolchak, along with the voiceovers. But I will say this, some of the positive things this episode has going for it is there's points in this episode, like in several of his other episodes, that even though the effects are not very special and very cheap, the atmosphere works. And I don't know. To me, I'll just jump into the final scene, and we'll jump around here a little bit in no particular order. The final scene, he's fighting the Cajun creature, as I like to call him, who's played by Jaws, by the way, Richard Kiel, the guy we talked about in the last episode, before he even got big from Moonraker with James Bond, one of the greatest James Bond adventures of all time. Kolchak going through the sewers is cool. It's unexpected. It really, really works. But when I see this guy hop out of the water, even though the timing of it and the shooting of it is good, and it makes you kind of almost jump for a second and you think it's good, it looks so bad fake in some of the scenes that I go to, could they just not edit that out, or did they not tell that you can see the zipper? Or it breaks your suspension of disbelief for it, and that's what's disappointing about it, because like I say, this episode had some interesting ideas, and I didn't care for the monster. I cared for the idea of this person being in a sleep deprivation chamber, and it's a subconscious that's rendering this creature into, to manifest in the real world. It's very, mid 1970s space sci-fi new age kind of nonsense stuff, with a little serious science behind it, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I really like that. But parts of it, like I say, this episode, I don't know. It's just, but no, that was actually one of my more favorite scenes too, and probably one of the most memorable ones. What about you?
Yeah, this episode relies a lot on Kolchak just being Kolchak. It's another one of those episodes where you're watching for mostly the interaction. It does have interesting ideas, but the ideas kind of just fall flat. The monster, the man in the ghillie suit. I read somewhere someone was saying this is one of the best looking monsters of the series. Well, let me get a ghillie suit and I'll show him up.
I'm gonna take a hard no on that. That's just me. I don't think so.
You don't think it's some of the best makeup, you mean?
No.
No, it's not. It's not. It's Whereas some people really find this like really high up on their list, this is a downer for me. Pardon me. At least it's not another situation where it's Jack the Ripper. I really didn't care for that episode because, well, I just found it a little off. And while this one is off, at least they have some kind of connection to it. Something that makes it clear. I don't know. It just feels like this is one of those missed episodes that we sit down. We actually sit down and watch it, and we're just, that wasn't what we think of when we think of Kolchak.
Well, the monster is different, and I think that's a very strong point in its favor, because we know that whenever we see a monster show or a TV show of some kind, we're going to see some sort of werewolf variant, Frankenstein, all your classic ones. And honestly, the reason why they're is because they're in the public domain. Thank you, Disney, for screwing things up since about the 30s. But that's the reality of it. And unless you get into really high-end storytelling where you're doing the hero's journey, like from Joseph Campbell, or you're doing a not so thinly disguised, say Catholic religious tale like Lord of the Rings, which some people love, some people hate because of that, you're going to have some hits or misses. And this one, to me, like I say, I think the idea that's interesting that modernizes it is the whole sleep deprivation part, because when you, obviously the whole idea of having super soldiers is nothing new to people that are into comic books or graphic novels, or it's an idea that goes back for quite some time in a lot of different cultures, but predominantly World War I and II, and where a lot of drugs are now actually out there on the streets, or come from experiments with soldiers and the government. So trying not to keep this completely a conspiracy element show, but the idea here that when you deprive yourself of all your senses, you get sort of in tune with your psychic self. Again, in the 70s, getting that on screen at the time was pretty cutting edge, because up to this point, other than the JFK assassination, where people really started not believing anything the government told them, you had very little thing out there in the public that would kind of clue you into things aren't exactly what the government tells you. You had the Manchurian Candidate, a really actually great movie with, I believe, Frank Sinatra as the hitman in it, who's the Manchurian Candidate, if I recall correctly, as the sniper in this film. And that was one of the first ones where, if you don't know what that means, it's a great way of Hollywood of introducing a concept like that to the general public. And one of the strengths of Kolchak we've talked about before is, while we really, really enjoy Kolchak himself, the idea of trying to modernize the monster of the week in a family-friendly episodic 45-minute TV show. How are you going to do it in the 70s? And Rosemary's Baby, other things in the 60s and 70s were successful in doing it, but you had to go a little bit different. And so, like I say, I really appreciate the idea of this going on, where it's taken into account something that's a little different. It's just, I agree. I don't know, something about it just doesn't feel complete or right. And it's not like I'm going to say it's chopped, it's poor edited, it's all chopped up or anything. It doesn't feel right. I don't know how to explain it.
So some of the things that I've looked into about this episode, but most of the episodes that we see are creatures based off of creatures found in folklore all around. This one actually, though, seems to be the creation of the writer. There's nothing in actual Cajun legend about a Parama Fate, or however it was called.
The Cajun creature.
Yeah, it wasn't actually in folklore. So the writers themselves made this, and maybe that's why it feels so off. Something is missing. They had to actually come up with it for themselves. Okay, I understand that. At the same time, I kind of understand why it's one of the weaker episodes. They weren't taking anything off of an idea that anybody knows. We know how aliens are treated in sci-fi. We know how vampires are treated in horror. It's understandable. This feels off because it's not based off of anything that we would expect, which I say good for them for trying to create something of their own, to morph something new. At the same time, we understand why it's in our books the weakest of the episodes that we've seen.
Well, in the 70s, you had this real big, like I say, push to modernize horror. And so a lot of other elements prevalent at the time was bringing the occult to the masses in TV and print media. There's definitely a rise in that. UFOs, alien sightings, those things were also getting covered. There's a popular show that called In Search of, with Leonard Nimoy, who was Spock from the original Star Trek series, hosted that and would bring all these things in, and people would talk about that. Mentioned before about how, in this case here, while it's not necessarily a government conspiracy that I brought up to you, I was talking more real life stuff. You do have psychedelic drugs and designer drugs starting to get more prevalent. I mean, LSD and the whole Timothy Leary thing was old hat by this point, and that's something that, you know, chemical mind inducing that gets some ultra plane of consciousness is still a thing today in terms of some people's ideas. And definitely in the 70s, people were checking these things out. So telekinesis, psychokinesis, you know, of course, Stephen King, you know, had Carrie and Firestarter and all these types of movies early on exploring that element. It seemed to be almost like a product of its time. And even David Cronenberg, the great Canadian guy that had some movies, a lot of body horror stuff here in the 70s and 80s, you still saw this. And it seemed like it kind of fizzled out in the mid 80s, I would say. And the reason why I'm mentioning all this is because, like I say, I think in a way where I'm trying to give Kolchak credit is a little ahead of its time, I think, trying to have something like this, even if they were just writing themselves not to have, you know, put themselves a little hole in the wall here. They got an episode up running for the week that this aired, and it seemed to work, because I got to tell you, again, going back to the final scene where he's going through the sewer, that the last 10, 15 minutes of this episode, it's actually great. And some of the Kolchak endings to me weren't, but, you know, obviously when you think of Kolchak episodes up to this point that we've covered, the one earlier episode where you have the burning cross at the end that he lights was pretty impressive at the end here. Richard Keel, the bad guy in here, he's a legit, you know, 6'10", 7-foot guy. He's a monster of a human being. And there's times here looking at him, it looks incredible. But I think the scenes that outdo the bad guy in this underwater scene, or in this scene here where Kolchak's here, Kolchak's trying to hide from him. He's going underwater. You know, he's been marked for death. No pun intended there for all you Seagal fans out there. I'm a Seagal mark a little bit myself. It's kind of cool watching him out of his element, having to deal with something, because we've seen him like in churches, we've seen him in houses, we've seen him interviewing the one dude in the real nice place. He was in the apartment complex with the older lady and the dog. Now he's here and he's in a sewer. I'm like, this is cool. He's wearing that stupid same outfit that he wears every scene we see him, no matter what time of day it is, or if he's on the swinging singles cruise that he was on, that even that one with the werewolf. And this one, he's still got the same outfit, and he's in his sewer running around while this guy's stalking him. And I'm looking at it now going, oh, I don't know. But damn it, he pulls it off. He's so good with that. That's what's embarrassing, that I go, man, a show 50 years old that is kind of data looking still can be pretty effective in terms of its creepiness or its entertaining ability to watch it, even if the monster literally walking into his little ship is kind of not too creative, so to speak. I don't know. I'm trying to be as positive as I can and not get any Kolchak hate from our fans.
So you know, I'm going to kind of agree with you there. That final fight, it is an enjoyable experience. As you're seeing him go around and swoop, it's absolutely. But sometimes I think that they just wanted to overcomplicate it. That it kind of got lost. The whole feeling of the episode. Let's add layers upon layers. No, sometimes you just need to make the monster and just deal with it then. Some swamp monster that comes to get children in their sleep, it's something that every culture has that kind of thing. If you don't sleep, you're gonna have this to come get you. It's something that's disturbing, but at the same time, to add that sleep deprivation, sleep testing, it just, I think that's where it kind of loses itself. But overall, I will say that it wasn't enough for me to dislike this episode. I've watched it. That's what I'll say.
Yeah. It's a must for any Kolchak fans.
Yeah.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah. But I will repeat what I said. I liked it better than the Jack the Ripper episode. I found it far more interesting. The concepts are absolutely interesting. And maybe if they had leaned into it a little more, make it where there's a whole bunch of things. It all depends upon his nightmares. And so the monster kept changing things, and they had to introduce a way to get ideas into his head to take it down. I don't know. But this is where we're at. We have talked about this night, and we are a little dissatisfied, I suppose.
Well, I'll mention this. Being older relative to you, as far as this, watching some of these older shows, like we're covering Twin Peaks also on Xtreme TV. Episode 1 of season 2 is getting ready to drop. I can go back, and I know we have some older listeners that have loved Kolchak, as well as some other shows that we do. They're really good at spotting people that maybe we haven't mentioned or talked about, that they kind of go, oh, I remember this person from this show. And one of the interesting things in TV in the 70s that was becoming very popular is if you were a really big star in movies, you could almost have a second career by being a guest star on one particular episode of the week of a show, whether it's The Love Boat, Fantasy Island, something like this. And it became not necessarily taboo. Typically, there wasn't much crossover, but it became a lot more apparent once we got into the 70s on television, where I think the medium was taken, if not more seriously, at least as another place to keep your brand going at the time, your curating, as it were, and also to pick up a paycheck. And for a lot of people, that seems to work. So for me, I always commented how when you're watching the show, one of the things I do like about it, even though it looks like a cheap budget, is how, even though most of it's shot in LA, some scenes are shot in Chicago. When you get to see the street scenes and the people, it does kind of take you back to a time where you remember, oh, he's driving his canary yellow convertible Mustang. And I remember seeing many Mustangs of that type back when I was going to school and such. But for here, I remember, God, that woman's kind of attractive in here, the assistant. Who is she? Do I know her? And I looked her up and went, okay, that's where I know her from, because this lady, her name is Elizabeth Brooks in here, she ended up playing in a movie called The Howling, which is on one of our lists for the top 10 on Top 10 Tuesdays for movies in the early 80s that we liked in the franchise, the Howling franchise, a werewolf franchise. And she died in her 40s or something, but she was a bit of a looker. And so sometimes you get people that might have been in Westerns or older shows just showing up on occasional episodes. You might get somebody young, like we had Tom Skerritt, I think, in the last episode, a younger Tom Skerritt, I should say, that obviously has had a long, lengthy career. You get to see some people that you go, oh, okay. And then you realize this just wasn't Darren McGavin playing Kolchak and a bunch of scrubs. A lot of Kolchak's episodes has had a really good supporting cast with them, too. So definitely that's continued no matter what we may think of the episode, how good or how bad it was or how interesting it was. They always seem to have done a decent job of attracting decent talent with them around it, and I do appreciate that it's not just Kolchak and a bunch of $10 a week nobodies that don't know what they're doing or acting. Everybody here, even if they have a bit part, even the doctor in here, that nobody cared about, who's explaining all the technical stuff to Kolchak, I thought did a fine job. And I don't know who he is and don't really care. He may be somebody, but I'm not going to go look him up. But no, I do appreciate that, at least from this show and a lot of other shows in the 70s and even 80s that did that too. All right, let's final thoughts.
I just have to ask because I can't remember. I don't think Ron was in this episode.
Mustache guy. Yeah, he was in there, but I don't remember if Ruth was, but no, there was. He didn't, I think, necessarily have a big speaking part too, so he didn't have an opportunity to get on your nerves. That was one positive of the show. Little Ron.
Ron Updike. Ron Uptight. Final thought.
Yeah.
It's another week in the neighborhood. I can't say that I have a recommendation for this episode. I would if I were to rewatch the series after we finish, this might be one of those that are like, oops, skipped over, don't know how.
Yeah, you don't mind going to make some popcorn while the episode's on. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. It's like, okay, it's on for background. You get to hear Kolchak and you go do your chores sort of episode. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have some disagreements too in the comments that we get for this episode, and that's okay. Not everybody's going to agree on it, but that's why we talk about it. So, yeah, it's not horrible. It's barely palatable. It's like medicine. You can take it. Just don't think about it. Hopefully that's the worst we have to say as we're halfway through going through Kolchak season 1 here on Xtreme TV. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank Pixel for showing up for that too. RDV was in transit, so wasn't able to make it this week. He'll be back next week for that too. So we're looking forward for his input on that. I'm sure he would have had plenty of things to say about the Spanish Moss murders. For everybody involved here at the Xtreme Movie Show, I'm your host, Rob. Thanks for listening. As always, stay extreme.
Stay safe out there.